I really wanted to change out this space a little bit by creating my own DIY dining room table exactly to fit the space, including a really large abstract, and I'm going to show you all the details in which I did. I have wanted to buy a dining room table for a really long time, but it is very expensive, and it's even more expensive with these live edge. But when I saw the liveedgetimber.com and came across the fact that I could actually put together my own live edge dining table in the exact size and dimension that I needed for a fraction of the cost, I was all over it. So there's definitely a few different wood styles that you can have, and I chose the maple just because I love the wood grain and the color of the maple. What's fantastic is you can create the exact width and length that's going to work for your space, and it comes with all the instructions and different leg hardware. The other great surprise that came with buying this was the fact that it already came with pre-drilled holes, so the pocket holes that are needed on the bottom, and everything was lined up perfectly so we could create the width, which will be 3 feet, and for the length, which will be 6 feet for the space. This works out incredibly perfect for anybody who's not familiar with making pocket screws or not really a lot of construction background. You're going to need 2.5-inch screws, and all the instructions come with the package. Everything was laid out exactly how you need it. So we have 3 boards on the inside, and as you can see, the pocket screws will screw into each other, and then the 2 live edge ends, the pocket screws are just above, so this way the screw doesn't actually hit end to end. I'll share some tips that we did. I picked up 4 additional seats for this table, and I love the fabric. It's completely 100% machine washable, which is fantastic, and I really like the style. I think it's simple and classic. We were pleasantly surprised how easy this project worked out, and the cost effect was amazing. So this turned out to almost $500 US in total for everything. Retail costs for these types of tables seem to vary between $3,000 to $6,000 plus, so I was happy to do this as a DIY. So a few things that we did to make sure that each board came across nice and even is we would use the wood clamps, but we also have C-clamps as well. And what we're doing is we're pressing the C-clamps on each seam as we're putting in the screws into the pocket screws. The pocket screws definitely would have taken a little while had we had to do that ourselves, so it was a real bonus that it came with the pocket screws already drilled. But the entire project ended up taking less than 2 days. To keep the tabletop as smooth and as straight as possible, we used the C-clamps and those wood clamps. As we ran the screws down the table, we would actually eject all of the clamps and bring them down as we were putting in the pocket screws. By doing this and adding the wood glue, it kept the boards as straight as possible, as we're still going to have to sand just to make sure we don't have any high points. Once everything was set up and we were moving along, we were able to get all the boards put together in one night. But I do have to say that having those C-clamps and as we were doing the screws, it really made those boards come together as seamless as possible. I've had a kitchen table, but I've never actually owned my own dining room table. So when I saw this whole project and thought, wow, if I can pull this off and put it together ourselves, this is going to be so beautiful, and we're going to have plenty of space to sit up to 6 people at once. But from a power screwdriver, the C-clamps, and the wood clamps, that was basically the only tools you're going to need in order to put this project together. Now, the biggest part of this entire project was actually sanding it, to be quite honest, and moving it. Once all the boards are together, it's extremely heavy, but with 2, it should be fairly manageable. But the sanding part of it is probably going to be a bit longer than actually putting it together. So there is a couple of small high points and we want to make this perfectly smooth. So I'm going to start with an 80 grit, then I'm going to move to a 120 grit, and I will follow up with a 220 grit just to make everything ultra smooth. We took turns sanding just because it was a big job, but it was worth it. It came out so smooth. I'm going to use the Minwax polyacrylic in the water base, and I tested a small area under the table first. I did a little safety test underneath just to make sure that the Minwax worked exactly what it said it was going to do. I knocked off any of the side loose birch that was on the table, and then we're going to go around and sand that portion as well with the orbital sander. Once I finished scraping off any of the leftover birch on the sides, we made sure to sand it with the 80 grit and the 120 and 220 as well. And again, moving this table was extremely heavy, so definitely want to take caution with that. I wanted to make sure that I sanded underneath the table because where the pocket screws were, there was a lot of rough edges. And of course, just to get the overall smoothness, not just for the top, but for the bottom. So I started with the actual Minwax polyurethane top coat. I used on the bottom only one coat. The top coat does dry very quickly, but you will note that once it's completely dry and you run your hand across it, it might be a little bit gritty, very, almost a little bit furry. So one thing I did is just lightly run the sander with the 220 grit just to give it a little buff and smooth it all out. For the top part of the table, I did the exact same process. I made sure to sand with the 220, make sure everything was completely smooth. I took a shop towel that was slightly damp and I made sure to wipe back any residual sanding dust. Then I applied my Minwax polyurethane top coat and I repeated this process twice. But as I mentioned, the sanding process was probably the biggest job in all of putting this table together. But what an incredible savings. In order to purchase this table and at the size that I wanted, I definitely saved myself a few $1,000s just taking the time to putting it together myself. I bought the Ikea chairs to go with the chair covers, and it was pretty easy to put together. With Ikea, it does come with the instructions and just a little bit of patience. Anytime I do purchase any type of chair, I like something that I can wipe and clean easily, so definitely having the covers that I can take off and wash or replace in the future is perfect. Anytime I buy chairs, and I bought 4 for this dining room table, I really look for things that I can wash. So having removable chair covers was a huge bonus. And I can trace this exact pattern and make my own for the future. I love the fact that you can actually trace this pattern and create your own seat covers in the future as well. I want to show you a very basic way you can make a huge canvas, a big abstract piece of art. The one I'm using I get from Michael's, and I always wait for the 40% sales, and it is a 4-foot by 5-foot canvas board. I'm going to be using acrylic paints, and I'm going to use a light, dark, and medium green, as well as a lot of white and just a hint of black. A couple of old brushes, and I'm also going to use some cardboard, and this is really going to help with moving the paint around. And I'm also going to be using a painter's knife. This is just made from plastic. You could even use a thin plastic cutting board for the same thing. The main thing with doing an abstract is just placing your colors down. So what I try to do is just create a gradient of the different colors, almost as if I was going to do an ombre. but I really want to share with you how I did the entire composition of this piece. The biggest trick with doing any type of artwork, or especially with an abstract, is you don't really want to think too hard about it. Just put the colors down. So again, what I'm doing is the darker onto the bottom and most of the white up towards the top. Anything that's in between is just going to make different shades of green. To mimic exactly what I'm doing, the best advice that I can give you is to make sure that you're constantly doing horizontal and vertical strokes. Don't do anything that's too cross-hatched and is kind of going in different directions. So a lot of vertical and a lot of horizontal, just brush strokes. And don't be afraid with acrylic paints to add water. So I'm using just a spray mist bottle to add a little bit of water to get the paint moving. What I'm wanting to create is a little bit of texture with the paint, and I'm also wanting to move some of the dark paint from the bottom to the top, and a lot of that white and light green to the bottom. And I'm going to show you exactly step by step how I did that. When I added the black, that was the main reason I added another paintbrush, and the only reason I'm going to be using this short handle paintbrush is so that way I'm not adding too much black throughout. So I'm only using this paintbrush at the bottom when I added the black. So once I had a lot of that blended out, what I did is I used the cardboard, and I'm just going to create what I'm terming a underneath texture. We're not going to see this as I will be going over this area again, but what's really happening is there's a bit of form and texture happening underneath. As we keep going on, you'll see exactly what I mean. Now, because this is quite a large canvas, I just did it in sections, so when it came to the blending. So now I'm going to go up the gradient with the green, medium, as well as the light green, and I'm even going to add a little tiny bit of the black from the bottom up towards the top. So what I'm doing with the cardboard is I'm actually just grabbing a bunch of the paint, and again, I'm just getting a little bit of texture for underneath when we get to the next steps. So I'm essentially pulling the paint, and I'm also trying to spread it across by adding a little bit of the dark and a little bit of the light to the opposite ends of the board. Another part of the composition I'm kind of going with is, again, making sure that everything, even with using cardboard, everything is in vertical or horizontal strokes at this point. This board is also a 2-inch in width, so I would take a little bit of the paint off my paintbrush and add that to the sides as I was going up. Now that I'm getting to the top third half of this board, I'm just going to be adding predominantly the white, and I'm going to grab a little bit of that medium green and just keep blending. And again, I'm using a lot of horizontal and vertical strokes only. But at this point in the project, you can see what happened with using the cardboards. I was able to pull some of that lighter tone from up top, bring it down, and a little bit of that darker tone up to the top. And this is what's kind of giving it that monochromatic look, but with an abstract effect. The most important part, especially if you're a beginner working with acrylics and you just want to play with canvas, is just have fun with it. Don't worry too much about what's happening and kind of trust the process a little bit, because at worst, if you don't like something, you can just grab some gesso, put it back on, and start over again. But it's a very therapeutic process, and you'd be surprised what you can create. The size canvas board that I have, I always wait with Michael's, the craft store, when they have their 50, if not 40% off, and you can pick these boards up for almost half off. So this board can run me about $100, but I think when you go to buy art, I think it's well worth the price, and plus you get the process and the fun of making it yourself. So I'm just pulling the paint with the cardboard again, and this again, a lot of that vertical and horizontal strokes is giving extra textures underneath. Then we're going to go and soften everything with a little bit of water and a little bit with the paintbrush. Soften everything out, and then this is where the plastic knife will finish off what I've started. So again, I'm just pulling a little bit of the lighter greens down towards the darker greens and vice versa. Any of the extra paint that's still on the cardboard, I would even run it across the sides on that 2-inch border that goes around the canvas. So this is where I'm just adding a little bit of water, and I'm just going to brush over everything nice and lightly so it's going to smooth everything out, and then the final step will reveal what happens. You do actually have a lot of working time with acrylic paint, but I do find adding a little mist of water here and there just helps with the blending. As I mentioned, it does look like everything that I was doing is being completely wiped out with blending everything, but it's not, I promise. It's because of the different tool and textures that we're doing it with. So the cardboard really made the imprint, and now when I go around with the plastic knife, what's going to happen is you're going to see the original imprint from underneath. So now I'm just kind of lightly pulling, and I'm going to be doing the exact same thing, a lot of vertical and horizontal strokes. When I use the cardboard, I would kind of push down a little bit harder than I did when I'm using the plastic knife. With the plastic knife, I'm just kind of going over quite lightly. If anything, I'm kind of just grazing the paint. And this is where you might even want to overlap some of the grazing that you're doing. So I'm doing the same thing again. I'm adding a little bit of the light towards the bottom and a little bit of the dark towards the top. And you're just going to keep going over and over until the actual piece comes together the way you like it. So I did this probably for a good hour, just kind of going around and just lightly grazing it. And when I liked how much of the gradient of the paint worked out from light to dark, then I pretty much stopped, and it should be dry within a few hours. And drying times can vary depending on your room temperature, but with acrylics it usually takes a couple of hours to be completely dry. But what I thought would be really dramatic, because I want to put it in the dining space and give it a nice pop of color, I would like to really add a nice contrast border frame and do it on the DIY. This is such a therapeutic thing to do, and of course you don't need to work on such a large piece. You could actually have 2 smaller pieces side by side with the same idea. And again, color palette is endless. I just chose the greens, but you could do this in blues, in reds, you could do this in pinks and oranges. And again, it just depends on the color choices that suit your style as well as your home decor. When you have the 2-inch width, because they have 1/2-inch width canvas boards, you don't necessarily need to make a frame. It's completely optional. I just thought it would be a nice little dramatic contrast, and I think what I'm going to use is just some old pine that I actually already have. This is 2-inch by 1-inch, and these are 6 feet long, which is perfect for the size canvas that this is. You're going to make 2 45-degree angles opposite on all 4 sides, so that way they kind of match nice and equal. So you're going to do 145 at a right and 145 at a left. I have some small metal clamps, and I'm going to use a little bit of wood glue as well as a nail gun to put everything together. But if you didn't want to actually go this step with a frame, the other thing you could do is just tape off a small border of maybe 1/2 inch around your canvas, and you could actually just paint the border onto the canvas if you wanted to do that. But this is sized exactly for the canvas board, so this is really going to be a floating frame. So I'm not going to actually attach it to the canvas, it's just going to kind of sit as a frame onto the canvas. Overall, I think everything turned out really nice, and I'm going to show you how this floating frame works actually onto the canvas. But overall, I'm really pleased with the final outcome. Let me know in the comments what you think. Thank you so much for joining me in this week's video. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. I have so many more fun DIYs to share with you soon. Until then, take care.